Everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Christina and today is Sunday, which means it's Spooky Stories Sunday. Did that in one go. I'm impressed this time. So Spooky Story Sundays is a mini series on my channel where I tell you a spooky story and I do my makeup at the same time. I'm doing these all the way until Halloween weekend and we may continue this after. I'm not sure yet. I really enjoy this series because it gives me something to research during the week and it also allows me to learn new things as well, which I thoroughly enjoy. So this is actually the third time I'm filming this. It's been one of those weeks. I'm hoping the beginning of this new one works out in my favor. So this is the third time I'm filming this, so hopefully I keep everything straight. It's kind of hard because once you film something once, you remember saying something and then you think you've said it in this video, but you haven't. So I'm hoping that I get it correct this time. There is a bonus spooky clip at the end of this video from one of the previous filmings of this, so if you want to see that, definitely stay tuned to the end or skip ahead, either way. But there was a little spooky moment that happened, so put that at the end, and now let's do this thing. If you like these videos, definitely make sure to hit that subscribe button because I do upload them every single Sunday, so if you want to see more of these, definitely hit that button. I also upload on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of my regular content, so if you want to see just more of me generally, definitely hit that button. And now let's get into telling this spooky tale. And as always, if you are interested in any of the makeup that I'm putting on my face or anything like that, it will all be linked down, as I pull my hair, down in the description. So today's story is actually the true event that inspired the movie. You may have heard of it, maybe you haven't. The Exorcist. I feel like The Exorcist is one of those movies that even if you're not into horror movies, you know exactly what it is. You generally know the plot. So this is the true story that inspired that 1973 cult classic. And I'll tell you, the real story is not crazy in the same way because obviously the movie was a movie and you know, Hollywood tends to embellish. This story is quite crazy though. A huge part of the online community doesn't believe anything about this story and then other parts do believe that it's real because unlike some of these stories that we've talked about so far in this series, this one has a lot of like first-hand accounts as well. Much like the Dakota story from last week, this one has a lot of like diary entries, just documentations just generally. But you know, just because it has documentation doesn't mean it's real. Keep an open mind, but also know that if you don't believe it, you're not alone. So this story takes place in a small, normal town, in a normal house, in a normal place, on a normal road in Missouri. The year is 1948-49, and we are not with a small girl named Reagan like it would have been in the movie, but with a small boy that we are going to call Roland. Now Roland isn't his real name but is a pseudonym given to him to protect the identity of the child involved. But Roland is a 14-year-old boy from a Lutheran background who by all accounts is pretty normal. According to a lot of Roland's classmates, he was quiet, reserved, unpopular, and unathletic. Honestly, it just sounds like me in school. He wasn't very inclined to socialize with others his age, or he was just socially awkward, but he wasn't really inclined to socialize with people his own age, but he did love learning and he was pretty intelligent. His grades reflected that he was pretty smart. But for the most part, he kept to himself. Instead of being inclined to play with kids his own age, his best friend came in the form of his aunt, the sister to his father, and her name was Helen. They were really close. Aunt Helen was into paranormal. She called herself a spiritualist, which a spiritualist is basically someone who believes and attempts to converse with the dead. Not exactly what I like to do in my spare time, but you know, everyone has to have a hobby, right? Aunt Helen shared this passion with Roland and at a very young age decided to introduce him to something that I'm still, as a 30-year-old lady, terrified of, which is the Ouija board. Now, I've debated on doing an entire video on the history of the Ouija board, but the whole thing freaks me out. I don't trust it. I know it's cardboard. I know it's cardboard and a little plastic dial, and I know people just make money off of it, but something about it just makes me feel uneasy. So Aunt Helen introduced this to Roland at a really young age, and they would spend afternoons together just, you know, talking to ghosts and doing spooky things that you do with your spooky aunt. Everyone has a spooky aunt, right? I have a spooky aunt. And like I said, they were definitely best friends. That was definitely Roland's best friend, who he felt the most comfortable with, who he probably confided all of his issues with. It was his best friend. In 1948 or 49, I can't remember which year, Aunt Helen passes away. And this seems to be where things turned for Roland. I mean, obviously as a 13, 14-year-old boy, losing someone you're really, really close to, especially a family member, has to be rough, and it is rough. I'm not discrediting anything that happens from this point on. I feel like everything that happened was just kind of did what he thought he should do. So like I mentioned, Aunt Helen taught him how to use a Ouija board at a very young age. So it was something that he was probably familiar with, and his first response after Aunt Helen's death was, let me pull out this Ouija board and let's talk to Aunt Helen. Again, I'm scared of Ouija boards, so it wouldn't have been something I would have done, but in his circumstance, it makes sense. That's what they did together, so like, pull out the Ouija board. Now, unfortunately, we're not really sure what kind of education he really got as far as his Ouija knowledge went, so I'm not entirely convinced he knew how to properly open and close a Ouija session, because I've read that's what you have to do. And it does seem like people who believe in the Ouija, that you need to have some sort of skill set in order to actually connect with the person you want to connect with, because otherwise you're leaving it open to the possibility of anything or anyone coming through. And he claims that he reached his Aunt Helen and communicated with her. That was really it on the surface level. But not long after he claims to have talked to his Aunt Helen, some weird stuff starts happening in the family home. Originally, this stuff isn't happening directly to Roland. It seems to be happening around the entire family. The first account was Roland and his grandmother, who lived in the home with them, were in the kitchen, and all of a sudden they started to hear dripping water. So they look at the one in the kitchen, and of course that one's not leaking. So they're like, oh, well, I mean, process of elimination, something in this house is leaking, so let us go and find the source. They check every single sink in the house, and not a single leak was found. Despite not finding a single leak in their house, they are still hearing the sound of dripping water. And it's really heavily prevalent in his grandmother's bedroom at the time. So they assume that it's just a leaky pipe in the attic, and they ignore it. They're like, oh, well, that's not a big deal. So they ignore it, and they decide, you know what, we're gonna go to sleep. It's fine, no big deal, just, you know, the roof may cave in. And eventually the sound of the dripping water does stop. The next day, however, more things start happening in his grandmother's bedroom, and they're hearing what sounds like tapping and walking in the room. And obviously there's no one doing that, but it's pretty subtle at first. So again, it's something that they choose to ignore, basically. There's nothing to be done about it, so they ignore it. Eventually, his grandmother is trying to sleep one night, and she claims that she's hearing what sounds like rats under the floorboards, scratching and making noise and just disrupting her sleep, basically. So Roland's father decides, well, I'll call an exterminator, but in the meantime, I'll pull up a couple floorboards and see if we can see anything for ourselves. So he pulls up a floorboard, and it doesn't look like anything is down there. No signs of any kind of rodent life, nothing at all. And they're like, well, that's weird. What are you hearing? So he puts the floorboards back, goes to bed, and she says, all night she was hearing rats chewing and clawing under her bed. The noises seemed to be on some sort of schedule, so they would always seem to start around like dinner time, around 7 p.m. and continue just until midnight, and then they would completely die down. This kind of sequence of events carried on for about 2 weeks, for about 11-ish days, before they elevated. From there on, the noise seems to move heavily into just Roland's room and disrupt him. He starts saying that he's hearing all sorts of things happening. Roland is basically claiming the same things that they were originally claiming, that they were hearing noises under the bed, that they were hearing leaking water. He also ends up adding that it sounds like someone walking around his bed at night. He's hearing footsteps from the side of his bed to the foot of his bed, back to the other side of the bed. So basically someone pacing around the perimeter of his bed, which doesn't sound like a very restful night's sleep to me. But again, this was something that the family themselves couldn't explain. They couldn't find rats, Nothing ever came up in the extermination report. They don't know what it is. Eventually, the noises do seem to travel into his parents' room as well. And his mother decides, you know what's a good idea? Let's see if he'll communicate with me. Roland already opened up that can of worms with the Ouija board. Maybe it's not a good idea. Just saying. But she decides that one night the noises are just too much for them, and they decide, you know what, let's ask this disembodied sound if it has an identity. Now, fortunately for them, they're not like me and they weren't cynics and immediately go to the worst. They seem to think that it was their sister, or sister-in-law in this case. Helen. They were like, oh, it must be Helen visiting us. No big deal. She was a little trickster in life. She's probably just making noise. So let's ask this disembodied sound if it's Helen, and if it's Helen, knock 3 times. 3 is not exactly the best number when it comes to anything paranormal, so don't know why they chose that number. And of course, on command, as spooky things like to do, it knocked 3 times. I would pack my bags and we'd be leaving, boys. We out of here. After the knocks happened, the regular sounds continued, so it seems to be the only correspondence that they were getting was, well, it must be Helen. Helen just being a prankster for no reason out of nowhere. But they didn't seem entirely convinced that even though whatever it was responded, that it was Helen. They didn't seem convinced completely that it really was Helen. It just, maybe the energy didn't feel the same. You know, like certain people have energies, or like how certain people you gravitate towards. Maybe they weren't feeling that. And like, I know that's like not a science and nothing you can prove, but some people do have that, you know? Some people, you know when they're there. You can feel their energy in a room. Or is that just me? Am I sounding crazy? So they were suspicious of this response, and not only did the little scratchy noises begin again, they started feeling something inside their mattress. All of a sudden it felt like a hand or a worm traveling inside their mattress. And I don't know about you, but if there was a mattress that felt like it had a wiggly worm in it, I would not be sticking around to see it come out. Not only that, the bedspread apparently lifted off of the bed and stood still, like it had been starched into a position. It stood there, and when Roland's mom went to go touch it, it apparently fell limp again. Things didn't seem to slow down in the household after this either. It seemed like whatever it was heavily around Roland from this point onward. Lots of things started happening around him, like unexplained fruit, like his pear on the table would fly off. At one point, he says that his Bible flew off the table and hit the wall. Now, his parents aren't entirely convinced that's what's happening. They think, well, he was close to his Aunt Helen. This must just be like teenager acting out, right? And that's what the parents thought. And this is also what their preacher or minister thought. Their preacher was also kind of under the same thought frame, was, well, it's all happening around Roland for the most part now, so it must be him. He must be acting out. So while his parents were still thinking that he could just be pranking them and just going through something, an event happened that kind of changed their mind because they witnessed it firsthand and couldn't explain it. So they were having a family dinner. They had a bunch of family members over, and Roland was sitting in like the family armchair. As he's sitting in the armchair with tons of witnesses of family around him, the chair levitated, came off the ground a few inches with Roland on it. Now, at first, a lot of people thought, well, Roland must be like jumping and like holding it in the air. But as they're watching it for just a few seconds that it's there, it tips to the side and Roland falls out, which again, you could almost justify by saying, well, he's jumping in the air and he fell over, right? That's a logical way of looking at it, right? So the family, to get him to stop, was like, look, we'll prove it to you that you did this, because Roland is claiming, I didn't do this. This isn't me. It's not me doing this. So the family's like, you know what? We're tired of these pranks. We're gonna prove it to you right now that you're the one acting out. So family members of all sorts, all adults, mainly men, sit in the chair and attempt to do the exact same thing with this chair. All of them fail. None of them can get the chair to do exactly what Roland just did. And again, he's a 14-year-old boy. So like, how does he have more strength than grown adult men to lift a chair and fall over in it while also simultaneously holding it for a few seconds in the air? No one can explain that. That event eventually leads them to really seek counsel with their preacher or their pastor. what is it in Lutheran? Is it minister, pastor, preacher? And the preacher, like I said, is under the same thought as the family at first. He's like, this is just a childhood prank. He's just mourning the death of his aunt. This is nothing you guys need to be concerned with. But the family is pretty adamant. They're like, no, like, really, listen here, sir. Something's going on with our kid and we can't explain it. We need your help. The preacher's like, fine, I'll help. I'll prove to you once and for all that your child is pranking you and that this is nothing to concern yourself with. So they decide to have a sleepover. It's a little odd, I think, to have a sleepover with your minister or your preacher, but that's what they do. So the entire family is going to stay with the minister and have a epic sleepover. Roland is going to be staying in the same room as the minister. They're not sleeping in the same bed. They're sleeping in 2 separate beds in one room. That way he can keep an eye on Roland at night, and the rest of the family had other sleeping arrangements in the house. So that night they get ready for bed. Roland is already in bed and the minister says that he sees Roland and he seems to be going to sleep. And at this point it's around like midnight. So I'm thinking the minister's probably thinking, aha, see, I got you. Nothing funny or weird has happened in the house since you've gotten here. And now that you're asleep, I bet nothing will happen. Wow, was he wrong. Not too long after the minister decides to go to sleep, he is awoken by what sounds like furniture rattling. So he opens his eyes to see that the room, for the most part, seemed really still. Nothing was moving and everything felt normal until he looked over at Roland's bed. He looked over at Roland's bed and Roland's entire mattress and bed frame were shaking, moving across the floor in slow, steady motions as if it was in an isolated earthquake on its own. Roland was on top of the bed, seemingly asleep. He wasn't reacting. There was no movement coming from him. He seemed unfazed, honestly. So the minister, in an attempt to stop the rattling, starts trying to grab the bed, and he's also trying to wake up Roland as he's, grabbing for the bed in an attempt, to stop whatever is happening. Something is going on, and we need to see if, is Roland doing this? He seems perfectly asleep, but maybe, this is all an act, So the minister is attempting to wake up Roland, and Roland seems to come out of his trance, and as he comes out of, his sleep-like state, the bed stops. So the minister is still thinking, this is an elaborate prank. He's fully pranking me, and he was not having it. He was not happy about this and really wanted Roland to stop. So in an attempt to get Roland to stop, the minister is like, you know what? Here's a blanket and a pillow. Sleep on the floor. Rude. Don't take the child's bed away, but okay. They attempt to go back to bed, and, well, oh man. As the minister is trying to lay there and sleep, he is awoken once again to the sound of something making just a huge ruckus. He awoke to see that Roland was now under the bed, violently hitting it. When the minister eventually pulled him out, he said he had scratches all over his face from the springs of the mattress. So I guess he was headbutting into the mattress. He had scratches all over him from the mattress. And he once again didn't seem awake. He seemed almost trance-like again. As their minister is trying to awake Roland out of his trance again, he obviously feels like he's out of his depth. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know why Roland seems to be unresponsive. They both sound wrong. He doesn't seem to be responding to anything that the minister is saying to him, and he just remains trance-like. So as any sensible man would do, he goes to the parents and he's like, hey, look, I can't help your kid. You gotta go somewhere else. And he advises them, hey, probably a good idea to go see a Catholic priest. It doesn't seem like the family wanted to take this advice immediately, so they go home, and it seems like a few more days pass, basically, where they're thinking it over. Roland's symptoms seem to be advancing at this point. He's now developed a habit of sleepwalking, which sleepwalking is really not that big of a deal. Lots of people sleepwalking, especially children who are going through puberty and stuff, or through high stress situations. He also is not only sleepwalking, but now he's also getting random scratches on his body that are unexplained. And at first they think they're self-induced, but Roland is claiming that he's not the one doing it. He isn't the one scratching himself, and he claims something else is going on. So this seems to be what really motivates the family to be like, maybe we should actually go find a priest. So they travel to St. Louis, and they do find a priest. Now, I learned a lot about exorcisms in this, in that exorcisms aren't typically performed in a person's residence. They're performed somewhere else with usually a group of people, and commonly it will be done in hospitals. That way you have orderlies and other nuns available to you, and it is a Catholic kind of thing, so that's why their minister was like, hey, you need to go see a Catholic priest, because they're the ones that typically do exorcisms. They first received help from a priest named Albert Hughes. He was 29 at the time, a relatively young priest, and I'm not sure of how much experience he had had with exorcisms or demonic possession at this point, but he was relatively young and unexperienced. Hughes is one of the few priests, and almost all of them kept diaries or journal entries of the occurrences with Roland. So that's why a lot of people are like, well, maybe this is real, because there is a lot of like diary entries. But in Hughes' entry of when he first met Roland, he said when Roland walked into the room, the room went cold, as if all warmth and kindness was pulled from the room, and Roland himself just gave off an energy of evil. Of course, that feeling isn't enough to be like, oh, yep, you're possessed. So priest decided to see Roland for a second time, basically doing like an interviewee type process of trying to figure out what was going on, if he was really possessed. And this wasn't like a first line of defense with the family. I mentioned that they went and saw a minister, but they had also seen doctors and psychologists already at this point. No one diagnosed Roland with anything. He seemed perfectly normal to them. There was nothing within his body that was wrong. There was nothing that they were aware of at the time that could have been causing this. So in his second assessment with Roland, Father Hughes said he was almost convinced that he was possessed. So typically a sign of being possessed is that the person will speak a language they do not personally know or have never been taught. Frequently we do see in like horror movies, it's typically Latin that they'll speak, and they'll speak in other tongues, and they will have more than one voice coming out at a time, stuff like that, which are all natural phenomenons that can happen without possession. So just throwing that out there as well. One of the things that happened that the father said proved to him he was possessed, Roland was possessed, was Roland apparently in one of their little interview processes looked him in the eyes and said in perfect Latin,
"You know who I am the devil. Why do you keep bothering with proof?"
Yo. At this point, Father Hughes was like, oh yeah, I know who we're dealing with. He told me his name. So at this point, Father Hughes committed Roland to a Catholic hospital. So apparently exorcisms are not supposed to be performed by anyone with a less than stellar reputation, honestly. You have to have more moral fiber than whatever you are trying to exorcise out of somebody. By all accounts, it doesn't seem like Father Hughes was considered that at all. So on March 6th, Father Hughes decides to begin the exorcism. He decides that the best way to proceed, and I don't know if this is normal because I don't know much about exorcisms, so please correct me, but they decide to strap this 14-year-old boy by the arms and legs with leather straps to the bed and perform this exorcism. Father Hughes knelt beside the bed and did the normal praying over him, blessed him with holy water, and they did the entire ritual. I couldn't find as many details on this because the details of how the exorcism process went isn't as important as what happens next, which is Roland somehow got his arm free at one point, pulled a metal coil out of the mattress, and attacked Father Hughes. He took a metal coil to Father Hughes's arm and cut from up his arm all the way to the wrist. Father Hughes had to get 100 stitches in his arm and was never able to use that arm again. He completely lost feeling, which means he cut deep. So basically that was a failed exorcism. It was never completed. Said that after that failed attempt and of course the attack on Father Hughes, Roland only got worse. Behavior became so much more erratic. After that, scratches appeared on Roland's body every single night that they couldn't explain. They still didn't know if they were self-induced or if someone was doing them to him. They couldn't explain where all of these scratches were coming from. He was still otherwise acting erratic, sleepwalking, lashing out, things flying across the room. In March of 1949, they decided to board a train and head back to St. Louis to attempt another exorcism. They were unsuccessful when they first arrived at finding anyone to help them. So one of their cousins actually had a professor at the St. Louis University who was a priest. This priest went by the name of Raymond Bishop, and he ended up writing the novel The Exorcism Log. He knew a thing or two, it seems. Now, Raymond Bishop wasn't entirely on board with the exorcism thing. At the heart of it, he said he was a skeptic, but because he was a scholar first and foremost, but he was interested in exorcisms. So much like Father Hughes, Father Bishop wanted to meet Roland for himself. He wanted to interview him, really kind of see what was going on with him. Father Bishop says the first night that he walked into the room with Roland, he said a few prayers, did a blessing on the area. He even paid special attention to where Roland would sleep at night and sprinkled holy water on the bed and placed a crucifix on the pillow and generally blessed the room. That night when Roland was sent to bed, he wasn't pleased with the state of his bedroom. As he walks into the room, everyone there heard a blood-curdling scream, and it was Roland having an absolute fit over the state of his room after touching the bed that had been sprinkled with holy water. Everyone ran up to the room, including Father Bishop. They walked in and saw Roland laying in the center of the bed while the mattress was violently shaking. Father Bishop decided to sprinkle holy water on Roland as he was on the bed, and that seemed to stop the mattress. The mattress stopped shaking, and they're like, okay, we're good. And as they turned to leave the room, it started shaking again. As it started shaking again, everyone turned and looked at Roland, and Roland started screaming at the top of his lungs and pulled his pajamas up to reveal scratches all over his chest. And they say that as he was showing the scratches on his chest, his eyes were zigging and zagging back and forth in his head. After taking that all in, Father Bishop was like, can't handle this, and he called in some reinforcements. He called in a priest by the name of William Bowden, who came in to assist him. Bowden basically met Roland and felt the same way as everyone else. Yo, there's something going on with this kid. And they decide, let's start a series of exorcisms on this poor boy. So according to Bowden, there's 3 levels of demonic possession. There was possession infestation, obsession, and then full possession. They believed Roland was at stage number 2. Bowden says he hadn't seen anything to claim of possession because they hadn't seen him speaking in tongues or having a voice come out that wasn't his, but Father Hughes said that he had heard that, so who knows. So like I said, successful exorcisms rely heavily on the priest or the father being very pious. So that's why they wanted William Bowden, because he was apparently that. He was a good-hearted person who had an upstanding record, and he was the man for the job. It does say that Bowden didn't really want to do this. He didn't want to go head-to-head with a demon, if that's really what was happening, but he was the only dude for the job. Bowden says, like all of the other occurrences, that as they began the first night of exorcisms, Roland's bed started to violently shake. And with exorcisms, he was doing the prayers over him, trying to get whatever it was to leave Roland's body. But it said that every time Roland would mention a heavenly figure of any sort, mention like God or Jesus or anything like that, a new cut would appear on Roland's body. So apparently whatever was going on did not like any of that. Eventually Roland's entire body is covered in scratches. So they decided, since whatever it is communicating in these scratches, that they would ask for the entity to leave its name written in scratches on his body, which how messed up is that? Like, the boy is already getting scratched. Like, don't be using him as a chalkboard now. So whatever demon was inside Roland was not there to play, and it said that the first thing that pops up isn't a name, but a place. And the letters H-E-L-L appear on Roland's body after that. So Father Bowden decides, well, I'm going to continue asking, and continues to ask for the entity to write whatever his name is on Roland's body. So on Roland's stomach appears the word go, and on his leg appears the letter X, or the Roman numeral 10. So they assumed that this would mean that something would leave in 10 days. Father Bowden wasn't sure if he could make it through a 10-day exorcism, but that seemed to be where everyone thought this was going. Roland, at this point, this first night of the exorcism, was done. His poor body was limp, he was covered in scratches, and he was emotionally and physically drained. So Bowden decided he would do one more final prayer and sing over Roland, and it seems like that seemed to calm him down, and Roland's body relaxed and kind of looked like it was going to sleep. But as they're singing and as they think Roland is asleep, Roland starts speaking. It's not Roland speaking anymore. Roland is now speaking in tongue. So the family returned the next night to do another round of exorcisms, and almost immediately Roland's body just started thrashing and flailing, much like the previous night. And the priests were basically convinced at this point that Roland was completely possessed. So unfortunately, this meant for the next few nights, this poor 14-year-old boy would return to the priest and have exorcisms done on him for hours every night for the next 10 days. They say over the course of the 10 days that this happened, the demons would show themselves more and more frequently. He would speak in tongue more and more frequently. He would levitate, he would lift off, he would throw things, he would spit at them, he would curse at them, he would basically mock them in voices that weren't really his. This goes on, and like I said, they were prepared for 10 days of this. By the 9th day, which was March 24th, 1949, this is the Holy Day, and it was also the Feast of St. Gabriel. So the priests were pretty convinced that this could be a very successful night for them, that they would be able to fully exorcise the demons out of Roland. It didn't seem to go that way at all. Instead, they had the demons within Roland completely taunting them further that night. And at one point, a demon spoke directly to Father Bowden, was like,
"If you would like to stay with me, well, I would like that too."
And then Roland's body went limp and he seemed to go to sleep. They thought that meant that the demon had officially left because Roland hadn't really gone to sleep at any point. He just kind of went limp. But at this point, it seemed like he had actually fully gone to sleep and seemed like he was resting. So as a test, they were like, you know what? Maybe this night of exorcisms worked. Let's send him home and let's see what happens. They sent him home and nothing happened for a few days, so they were pretty convinced at that point that they had successfully gotten out the demon. But 4 days later, Roland began exhibiting the exact same symptoms all over again. It originally started with Roland saying he was feeling sick, and so his mother sent him to bed, and when she came to check on him later on that evening, he was trance-like again in his bed, and he started writing things with his fingers that she couldn't understand. He also began speaking to her, and he basically told his mother in a voice that wasn't his,
"If he becomes Catholic, he will be safe again."
His mother told the priest, and the priests were like, well, that's what we gotta do. We gotta baptize him. So on the way to the baptism, apparently the demon had other plans. There would be no baptism today, sir. In the car, Roland falls into a deep trance-like state again, and in a low guttural voice says to his parents as they're driving him,
"So you're going to baptize me, and you think you will drive me out with holy water?"
And then he lunged forward and attacked his parents driving and tried to swerve the car off the road and hit something with it. Luckily, his parents were able to control the car and they were fine, and they arrived safely to the baptism. But oh man, that's scary. It took 4 attempts to baptize Roland and 4 grown men holding down this 13-year-old boy. After the baptism, they say that Roland looked relatively calm and like the demon had left, so they performed another exorcism and were pretty sure that that was going to be it. So they sent him home again. A few days later, or a couple of weeks, I think, maybe, on the 18th of April, a new Roman numeral appeared on Roland, and it was the Roman numeral for 16. The priest honestly weren't sure if they would be able to make it that long, or if Roland would even make it that long, because the exorcism was very, very tough on his body, but they pushed forward and did more exorcisms. They said that they pushed their limits every single night, which means they were going all night with these exorcisms, yelling, praying over him, throwing holy water on him, having him strapped to a bed, all while his body is thrashing, getting scratched, and he's yelling at them in tongue. By the end of the exorcisms, they say that Roland physically didn't look like himself. His face was gaunt, his stomach was distended. He just didn't look like himself anymore, which is just tragic, honestly. Bowden decided that instead of doing his exorcisms in the normal way on this last night, instead of doing the prayers in Latin, he was going to do them in English. I don't know what this shift really means or what it would really entail, but that was the shift that he wanted to do for this last night. This seemed to enrage whatever was going on with Roland, and Roland reacted by spitting at all of the priests after hearing the prayers in English. Roland is contorting his body, spitting at them, full of rage, lifting through the straps, just contorting in weird ways and just not seeming human at that point. But eventually, when Bowden gets to his final prayer, which all of them have now been done in English, he says that a calm goes through the room. After his body relaxes, they say they hear a new voice come through Roland. And it's a different voice than they've heard the entire time that they've been doing exorcisms on him. And it's a deep, clear voice. And it said, "Satan, I Saint Michael, I command you to leave the body in the name of Juvias immediately. At that was the end of the exorcisms. Roland seemed fine, and from what I know, if Roland was still alive, he would be in his 80s now, and from everything that I've read, he had a normal life. He got married, he had kids. They claim that his first child was named Michael after Saint Michael, who saved him essentially. And the priest, for the most part, feel like they failed Roland though, because of how difficult these exorcisms were on him, and that they weren't successful early on to really save him the torture basically that happened to him for a few weeks. That, guys, is the true story of The Exorcist, what inspired the movie, and what do you guys think? Part of me, I just feel like it's a tragic story, and it's basically just, you know, 4 grown men torturing a small child for months. And moral of the story is, don't play with a Ouija board. Don't do it. Leave it alone. That's the moral of the story. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up down below. Also make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet and you want to see more of these. And if not, that's okay too. But just remember, guys, there are always spooks to be found. And I hope that means I see all of you guys in my next video. Bye. So there was one account where Roland said in perfect Latin,
You know who I am the devil.
My camera just went out of focus there. That's not making me feel good. What are you focusing on? Thank you. I don't like that.